Hey guys, so happy new year, and as is the tradition, I am posting my favorite reads of 2020, and I really couldn't narrow this list down that much, so I decided I was just going to share all of my favorite reads. So there are a lot of them, and I'm going to not really talk too much about each one. I'm just going to kind of give like my general idea of why I really liked the book, but I do have a top 3, so stay tuned for the end of the video, and that's when I actually will have somewhat of an order. But really, the order that these books are kind of going to be shared in is just going to be like from when I read them, because I'm just going to be going through my list of the year. So it's really just organized by date read until I get to the top 3. So in total, I read 64 books in 2020, and 9 of those were audiobooks, which I'm hoping to read more audiobooks in 2021. But anyway, let me get into my favorite reads of 2020. First on the list is All the Ways We Say Goodbye by Beatrice Williams. This is a historical fiction. It actually follows 3 different females from World War I to World War II to the 60s, I believe it was. How they kind of combined World War I and World War II, and then like I said, I think it's the 60s, was really unique, and how they all really didn't seem like they fit together, but then eventually they kind of followed a similar storyline. I thought it was so well done, and each of these stories did have a romance element to it as well, which definitely kept my attention, and I think all 3 stories pretty much equally. Like, I don't know if there's any one in particular, now thinking back on it, that I thought that was my favorite. I really just loved all of them. So this is definitely a historical fiction I would recommend. The next book I picked up was during quarantine, and I read this with some friends, and so of course this had to make the list, and that's Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This book is, I think it's considered historical fiction. I don't know actually what this is considered, because it's not exactly contemporary, but this is a very popular book, so I'm not really going to give too much of a synopsis here. But what I really liked about this book, which I wasn't a fan of at first, because I didn't really know what was happening with the story. You're following this girl's life, and I didn't really understand like what the big plot was. I thought it was going to be more of a mystery. It starts off with someone's dead in the future-ish modern time, and then you're going way back to following this little girl growing up, and you're just like, what's happening there? But once I sunk into the fact that we're just learning about this girl's life, I really loved it. It was such an interesting life that this character led, one that I honestly have never encountered anyone who's lived like this. She pretty much lived on the edge of society, one with nature, and she was just such a unique character. That is definitely why I loved this book so much, and I loved that we got to see like her full story, like her full life. I just ended up really loving it. But I think the main reason I loved it so much is because I read it with some friends during like a very tumultuous time. Next is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This is a very quick thriller. I read it in just like a day or two. What I loved most about this book was the setting and kind of the creepy feel for it. So this takes place on an island off the coast of Ireland, and it's during one weekend. It's this wedding party, and you're following multiple different characters. You know someone dies at this wedding, and it kind of starts at the beginning of the weekend, and they all have these really dark and twisted like pasts, and I just thought it was so fascinating, and there was just something like so creepy and dark and gloomy about this whole book that I just thought it was such a great thriller, and I really enjoyed it. First romance on the list, and honestly this is very close to my top 3. I loved it that much, and that's Bringing Down the Duke by Evie Dunmore. What I loved about this was that it was like a modernly told historical romance, so there weren't like the bad parts of historical romance were in this. Like, this is like a pro-feminist read, which obviously was hard in that time when women didn't have rights, but part of this book is the main character is in this women's rights group, and she's actually just trying to convince this duke to be part of her cause. It's very much a hate to love story, and I just love this. Like, if you like historical romance, if you like Pride and Prejudice, if you are watching Bridgerton, you need to read Bringing Down the Duke, because it will like fill the hole in your life that Bridgerton left when it was only 8 episodes long. So, would recommend. Next, I have my first fantasy, and I think this is actually my only fantasy, and that is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is actually a young adult fantasy, and I hadn't really read any young adult fantasy up until this point in the year, and was so blown away by it. It really snuck up on me. I didn't think I was going to love it as much as I did, so it was definitely a surprise, and like the best kind of surprise. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and that right there is probably the reason that I loved this book so much. It also has like a modern day element, because this girl, she lives in Washington DC, and then she kind of like goes to this alternate reality universe where there is like a prince who's under this curse, and it's definitely hate to love, as is Beauty and the Beast, and I just loved this. If you like Beauty and the Beast, I think this is so worth your read. It, like I said, it just really caught me by surprise. Slow burn romance that developed from it, so good, A+. Next, I have the Happy Ever After playlist by Abby Jimenez, and this is another romance, and I really loved this book. It's a companion novel to her first book, which was The Friend Zone, and it was very different from The Friend Zone, but I really liked, first of all, that this kind of had a totally different storyline where our main character is grieving a loss, and you're following her a couple years after that loss and how she gets into a new relationship. But also what I really like about this was that it wasn't like they get together and the book is over. Like, they get together relatively early on, and then you're following like their relationship in the second half of the book, and I really liked that second half of the book. I think way more than the first half, because I love seeing like these established relationships and then the struggles that they're going through in their relationship. And an element I also really liked about this, which I haven't really read much of these, but it was like, I don't know if you would call it a rock star romance. I guess it's kind of that. Like, the boyfriend in this story, he is like an up-and-coming musician, and so there's a lot following his career as it's like progressing really rapidly and how that's affecting their relationship, and I just really loved that element of the story. I wasn't expecting it at all, and I just thought it was so interesting, and it kept me hooked even the second half of the book. The next book is another thriller mystery, and that's Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. I found this book to just be so interesting from the start. I love that it follows like a haunted house, and you're kind of uncovering the secrets within this haunted house through the past and also the present day, where this girl who had this really horrible experience when she was young in it has now returned to it as an adult. And I just love that she's trying to fix up this place to sell it, but like the house is telling her its story, and definitely had some creepy elements to it. It wasn't outright scary by any means, but there was definitely a haunting feeling about this house, because you know this house has a really bad past, and I just love like any type of uncovering secrets type of story. So I knew this was going to be a favorite, and it definitely hit the mark. This next one is very unexpected. I think it's the only one on this list. It's a young adult contemporary romance called Tweet Cute by Emma Lord. So this is another one that I went into reading thinking it was just going to be a nice cute little story, and I ended up loving it way more than I thought. And I loved it so much because it really reminded me of a mashup between You've Got Mail and A Cinderella Story. It's following these kids in high school trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, but there's this element to Twitter. They both have these like Twitter accounts, and their families run these businesses, and they kind of go into a Twitter war together, hence like Tweet Cute. And it's so good. There's an anonymous element to it. These kids, they're kind of like enemies at first, so it has the enemies to lover trope, which I love. And I just thought it was so cute. Like, I seriously wasn't expecting this to be a favorite of the year, but it really surprised me. I actually read like 3 favorites in a row. So the next one, this is the only sci-fi I have on this, and that's Recursion by Blake Crouch. This one wasn't a surprise that I was going to love it, because I loved dark matter, and I went into this with pretty high expectations, and it actually met them. To avoid giving away any spoilers, I will just say it starts off with the idea of memory and goes in a crazy direction that I wasn't expecting, and this was just so fast-paced and so engaging, and just like, I feel like I wish every book kind of kept me as hooked to the page as this one did, because you just honestly didn't want to stop reading. It was just that engaging, and so this had to make my favorites list just because I really didn't want to put it down, and it was just so entertaining. So of course this had to make the list. Next, I have kind of a bummer. I think a lot of people have read this already, but I did end up reading The Kite Runner. This is one that was really hard to read, quite honestly. Like, I thought the beginning was hard to read in parts, and I thought, oh, I got through the hard part, and I was just completely gutted by the events that happened later in this book. Honestly, outright devastating and very dark, but I truly loved this. I think it's a modern classic for a reason. I have another historical fiction, and that's Lost Roses by Martha Hall Kelly. This is World War I historical fiction, and it's no surprise that this is on the list, because when I read Lilac Girls by the same author, it also made my favorites list. So this is similarly told in the way that her first one was told. It's following 3 female characters, all with different perspectives during World War I. And I love, like, there's like a New York social elite lady, and then there's two Russian women. One is like from a wealthy family, and then one is not, and it's following all of their stories. Honestly, I felt so infuriated with one of these characters in particular, like most of the book, and so it was hard to read that part, but it definitely kept me wanting to read. And I like how this was told with the three female perspectives that were so different, because you always wanted to keep picking it up, because you always were like left wondering what was going to happen with the other girls. Like, it definitely kept it going. Like, the pacing was really well done, and I just love all the different perspectives that we got. And this takes place over quite a few years too, so I really liked that element as well. Like, it felt like such a good story. If you like historical fiction, like, for sure would recommend this one. I don't even know what number I'm on, but I'm just gonna keep going. Next I have Troubled Blood. This is book 4 or book 5 in the Cormoran Strike series by Robert Galbraith. This is another great installment in the series. I can't say much because it is the 4th or 5th book, like I said, in the series. I really love the characters and the friendship between Strike and Robin, and I just love reading about them. And this is a long book, but I feel like it was equal parts like their personal private lives mixed with the mystery, so I understand why it was so long, and I definitely don't mind that it was so long because I loved all of it. And the mystery itself was also very interesting. There was an element of what's it called, like horoscopes to it, and zodiac signs, which just made it very interesting. And this also was a cold case. It was something different from all the other books in the series, and I really enjoyed it. The last one before I get to my top 3 is Things You Save in a Fire by Catherine Center. I just, first of all, really loved this one because it was just such a good romance that also had a lot of depth to it. I don't want to give any spoilers as to why it has depth to it, but it's following a firefighter, a female firefighter, something I've never read about, so that was just very interesting to me. And obviously she has to overcome a lot of barriers in this male-dominated kind of workplace environment. It's following her relationship with one of the firemen that she works with, which is obviously completely forbidden, but is just so heartwarming and endearing, and I loved it. And I mentioned this on Instagram, but you get to a point where you just have to read the rest of the book. Like, I don't know, it's probably like right around here, you just, like, the last 100+ pages, you honestly cannot put down. It is very interesting. I wasn't expecting it to end the way it did, like, in that sense. So I really enjoyed this, and it definitely had to make my favorites list. Okay, so I just actually had to delete a lot of memory on my camera to be able to film the end of this video, which is my top 3, which I really need to get to. So let me get into now my top 3 reads of 2020. Coming in at 3rd place is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This book is on many people's favorites list, so I'm going to keep it nice and short and sweet here about why I really loved this book. And I just have to say, with her writing and the way that she told the story, I totally felt transported in time and space just to where Addie was and what she was living out. And I really ended up loving the 2 elements of the story, like the modern day element and then the history of Addie and how we saw her and Luke, who's the god that she made this deal with 300 years before, how they meet every year, and their interesting relationship that they have with each other. They truly had me feeling so conflicted, and especially conflicted with, like, the modern story that was being played out. So I just felt all kinds of different ways reading this book. I also really had a deep sense of sadness reading this book, just imagining this kind of empty life that Addie was forced to live because of her deal with Luke. And I don't know, I just think it was so well done though, and I was just so captivated by this story that it for sure had to make my favorites, and I probably will be reading this again in 2021. This book gives me all the warm fuzzies, so unlike Addie, which made me feel a little melancholy and sad, Beach Read by Emily Henry, this is a romance book, and I gotta say, it's romance, but there is a heavy emphasis on, like, non-romantic relationships and discoveries in this book. So our main character is January, and she is a romance author. She writes happy ever afters, except her life actually takes a huge turn and she starts to doubt if happy ever afters actually exist. And so she cannot write another romance book because her life has literally fallen apart and she does not know what to do with herself. So she is actually going to her father's beach home to kind of wrap some things up there because he's passed away, and also try to like knock out a book while she's there. Well, her neighbor at this beach home is like her rival in college writer. He writes very smart literary fiction, and so they kind of create this deal that they are going to swap genres with each other. They're going to take each other on these little weekend adventures where she shows him romantic things and he shows her like darker kind of things, and they're both kind of tapping into different parts of their writing style, but they're also learning about each other. January is grieving the loss of her father and then what her father had done to her family, and it's just a fantastic story. I cried at the end of this. I think everyone I've talked to who has read this book has cried, so just know it's gonna happen and it's totally fine. We all were there, but we all loved it. Overall, this book was fantastic. I for sure will be reading this again in the future. And then my favorite book of 2020, I don't know if you're gonna be surprised, but it's Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. I have a review for this book where I just am basically saying please read this book because it's amazing. This book was just a warm hug on a cold day. It was everything you need to read right now. Like, I promise you, this book is written for everybody. It is the most wonderful, I don't know how Frederick Bachman does it, but the way that he writes his characters just tugs at my heart and just like makes me evaluate myself and my friendships and my relationships with my family a little bit differently. And he had such a way of making like a very loosely defined plot story very engaging, because this is a plot that is not fast-paced at all. It is just about these characters and their interactions and their understanding of each other. And at first you're reading this book and you're like me and you're thinking, this is ridiculous, like why are these people this way? But you just have to keep reading because it will transform you. At least I hope it does. So I would definitely recommend to you Anxious People if you haven't read it. That's like my #1 book recommendation of 2020 and going into 2021. I highly would recommend all of these books. If any of my favorites were your favorites, I'd love to hear about them, or even just tell me like what was one of your favorite books of 2020. I'd love to hear it. But thank you so much for watching and happy reading.